All right, we are live. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Catamaran Writing Conference virtual reading and lecture series. I'm Matt Simmons, and I'm your conference manager this year for the online series. Um, we're sorry that our conference couldn't take place this summer at the beautiful Stevenson campus on 17 Mile Drive. It's become a 7-year tradition to hold the conference there, and it would probably be extremely beautiful right now. But due to the pandemic, we had to postpone the conference. And we look forward to seeing you next year, though. The dates for that conference are the 25th of July to the 29th, 2021, of course. And you can register for that now on the Catamaran website. But a year is too long for us to wait to get connected with the community of poets and writers around Catamaran. So this week we have several talks and readings that you can register for, and you can check them out on Crowdcast at Catamaran Literary Reader. On Monday, we focus on poetry with Zach Rogow, Joe Millar, and Susan Brown. On Tuesday, we focus on fiction with Karen Joy Fowler, Joseph Novakovich, and Lisa Fugard. And then on Wednesday, we're going to turn to nonfiction to close it out with Neil Snydow, Joan Staffen, Charles Hood, and Dan White. And we hope you'll join us for some of these. If you want to know more about them, each of the descriptions on Crowdcast has a little bit of a brief explanation of what the talk or reading will be about. But tonight, we're going to kick off the reading with Jane Smiley, who is going to give us some inspiration for our writing lives. Jane, probably all of you are very familiar with her, but she is the author of 14 novels, 2 short story collections, 5 books of nonfiction, and 8 young adult novels. Her book, A Thousand Acres, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1992. And The All True Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton won the 1999 Spur Award for Best Novel of the West. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts since 1987. She won the PEN USA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2006 and chaired the judges panel for the prestigious Man Booker International Prize in 2009. Smiley's most recent works are a trilogy of novels about an Iowa family over the course of generations. The first novel of the trilogy, Some Luck, was published in 2014. This March, she published her 8th young adult novel, Taking the Reins. Her forthcoming book, Perestroika in Paris, comes out in December, and she's happy to take questions about that. Speaking of questions, though, before I hand you off to Jane for her talk, ask a question at the bottom. If you all see that, is where you're going to be able to put in a question that after her talk, I will read out to her and we'll get answers on. So that's the best way we're going to be able to communicate here. But now I'm going to leave you all with Jane to hear her talk, which I am also looking forward to. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I wish I could see you, and I certainly hope you can see me. It's really fun and interesting to be doing this. I do have my eye on your comments and your questions. I will try to pay attention to them, especially after the first 20 minutes. Anyway, and I apologize if the dog comes running out barking like crazy because that's what she does. What I was told I should talk about is my process. And so that's what I'm going to start with. And my process is to look around. That's basically my process. And sometimes I see something that inspires a novel. And that's been true since the beginning. I think that the root of my process is curiosity. I see something, I wonder what's going on, I want to find out more about it. And then as I learn more about it, I think, that would be interesting. That would be a fun thing to write about. So, for example, with 1,000 Acres, I had been annoyed with the play King Lear since high school when we first read it, because I felt like the daughters, Goneril and Regan, didn't really get a chance to say what they thought about what was going on. And so one day when I was living in Iowa, we were driving in the late winter from Minneapolis back down to Ames, where I lived. And the northern part of Iowa is extremely flat landscape. And I remember looking around in the gloom and saying, this is the spot. This is the spot where I should set that Lear novel. And so then I started looking up information about that landscape, and that got me really interested in the history of farming in Iowa and how that might fit in with a book set, a book that retold the story of King Lear. In the 90s, I've always been really interested in horses, and in the 90s I began going and watching races, and I thought, boy, this is really weird, this whole system. And so that's what ended up being Horse Heaven, a book about horse racing. So it's been like that. Once I get the idea, then I read about it and I keep doing the research until the first thought of how to begin occurs to me. And then I sit down and I keep writing until I run out of thoughts, and then I do more research, and then I keep writing. And so far, there's always been some point at which I think, okay, I know how this is going to work. But mostly my way of going about things, or my process, is a mode of exploration rather than a mode of confession. I've never really written anything about my own life. My own life has been fun for me, but pretty boring for other people. And so it's mostly about being curious and wondering about things. All the books that I've written have been different, though, and I've gone about them slightly differently. And so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 6 books here that I've written, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them. First, I'll talk about Taking the Reins, which is the most recent of the kids' books. This is it. And this is the third in a series from the point of view of a girl who starts out in the first book around the age of 11. And she she gets to take writing lessons in the Salinas area. She lives over in Pacific Grove. She wants to take riding lessons and to have a horse more than anything, but her parents really can't afford much more than lessons. It takes place during the 1960s. So this is volume 3. And that was the part that was fun, because I have a good friend who grew up on a horse farm in Australia. But I thought, okay, I'm going to put a boy in a horse book, which is kind of rare these days because boys don't really ride as much as girls do. And as soon as I put the boy in the horse book, I knew I had a troublemaker, a fun, enjoyable, amusing, nice troublemaker, but definitely a troublemaker. And so as soon as I introduced him, what he's doing when this girl is named Ellen, and his name is David, but he's known as Da. And as soon as the first thing Ellen sees him doing is walking on the roof beam at the barn, because, he just has to do it. So that was a lot of fun. And I really like writing kids' books because I like them to they move along smoothly. The plot has to be understandable. The psychology of the characters has to be understandable to a 10 or 11-year-old or a 13-year-old. And so I find that to be quite enjoyable. This one was the most difficult. It's called Private Life. It was published in 2010. And it is somewhat based on my grandfather's family. He was from Central Missouri, and he had a sister who married a man who became a notorious physicist This took place in the late 19th century. And this is from the woman's point of view, a woman who's married to a man who's very difficult to understand and hard to get along with. And because of the way things were in those days, she stuck with him basically for life. And I found I had to rewrite it over and over and over and over again. It took me a really long time. My editor could not be satisfied. And then finally, I was in San Francisco. It takes place up near San Francisco. That's what the cover photo is of the 1906 earthquake. I was in San Francisco, and I was just walking around, looking around, thinking about it. And then for the first time, really, I saw things from his point of view. And as soon as I let myself see things from his point of view, I'd always thought of him as a jerk. But as soon as I let myself see things from his point of view, I started looking at things slightly differently. And I can't say that I had more sympathy with him because he was still a jerk from the outside, but I did have more empathy with him. And that was interesting to me. I didn't expect this one to be hard, private life, but it turned out that it was. And that's another thing. It doesn't matter how many books you've written. When you start out on a new book, you think you know what you're doing, but actually you don't. You know what your habits are, you know what you like, you know what you're curious about, but you don't necessarily know how you're going to get from the beginning to the end. And that was a good lesson for me to learn. And I ended up liking it. And my editor actually ended up liking it too. Excuse me. So, oddly enough, now I'm going to show you the one that was the least difficult. And it is also my favorite, or one of my favorites, and that's The Greenlanders. The Greenlanders is set in Greenland, on the west coast of Greenland, southwest coast of Greenland, in between about 1450 and about 1504. And what got me interested in it was that there was evidence that there had been a quite interesting society there. There were some I loved Icelandic, and I loved Icelandic sagas, but there were Icelandic sagas about the beginnings of Greenland, but there weren't any about what happened. And I was really curious about what happened to the colony that lived there. And so I went to Greenland. I looked around. I was fascinated by it. I looked up all the research I could find, archaeological research and historical research, and that was fascinating too. I was writing it before the internet, so it was published in 1988. So it was harder to find things about it than it is now. But I read the books, and I started writing it, and I made a decision that has to do with how to write a historical novel. You have to choose. Are you going to use a modern style that the reader can understand easily, or are you going to use a style that sort of mimics the style that they would have been thinking in back in those days? Now, I had taken a lot of Icelandic, and I'd read all the Icelandic sagas. And what interested me about medieval Icelandic was that you didn't say, for example, if you had a dream, the language for having a dream wasn't, I had a dream. It was, it dreamed me. So to me, that meant that a lot of these people saw their inner lives as external rather than internal. And I needed to put that in there. It took me about 50 pages to get into it. And then the reason it was easy was that once I was into it, it was like just putting a big polar bear skin over my head and going for it. I felt like it swept me away. And that was the only time that I've ever had this feeling of being lost in the material, to the point where I just kept on going. It was a fascinating thing. It was a fascinating thing to happen, and I really enjoyed it. And for that reason, The Greenlanders is one of my favorites. And I'm sure there's maybe one person in the audience who's read it. It's not that easy to read, but I hope there's one person in the audience who's read it. I will say that when I was first starting out as a writer, The Greenlanders was the one I wanted to write. But I also wanted to write in all four major genres. That means I wanted to write a tragedy, I wanted to write a comedy, I wanted to write an epic, and I wanted to write a romance. The tragedy was 1,000 Acres. The Greenlanders was the epic, and this was the comedy. This is Moo, and it is set at a land grant university where I just happened to be working at the time at Iowa State. I worked at Iowa State for about 10 years, 14 years, something like that. And it wasn't supposed to be about Iowa State. It was supposed to be about the idea of the land grant university, which I found very interesting. And as I was thinking about the characters and this place and the setting and what the plot would be, I thought about a boy who goes in the door of a building that everybody thinks is deserted. And at Iowa State, there was a building that wasn't really in use anymore. Anyway, the boy goes into this building that's deserted. And I'm thinking, what is he doing in there? What's he doing in that building? And that's when the idea came to me that his job is to feed a hog that is part of an experiment that an ag professor wants to see about how much, if you didn't stop a hog from eating, how much could the hog come to weigh? And this was in the early 90s, and there was a agriculture secretary named Earl Butz, who was famous for saying to farmers, "Get big or get out." And I thought, okay, I'm going to make fun of him, and I'm going to name that hog Earl Butz. There's a big cast of characters, professors, students, researchers. Probably the main character is the chancellor's secretary. She's the one who's basically in control of everything. I had it work itself out over the course of most of a school year. And I just laughed myself out of my chair. I would enjoy writing it so much. I'd write something, I think it was so funny. I would take it in to where, my family was sitting watching TV, and I'd say, okay, listen to this. And I'd read a few sentences, and they'd look at me and go, huh. Well, it made me laugh. And that's what you hope for with a comic novel. So I truly enjoyed writing Moo. This 1,000 Acres, as you know, is the most successful. When I started it, I said to my agent, I want to write a book based on King Lear set in farm country. she said, nobody wants to read about farm country. I said, well, too bad. I think it's important and I want to write about it. And the task that I set up for myself was to follow King Lear as closely as I could, to make it plausibly set on the farm so there couldn't be a war, but to make it close to the way that the plot of King Lear plays out. I found that very interesting, very fascinating, sometimes frustrating, but it gave me a feeling of connection with King Lear. And in some ways, it gave me sort of a feeling of connection with William Shakespeare. When I was growing up, we read William Shakespeare every year in high school. And then in college, I read him too. And he was very well known for repurposing older material. That was a common thing, and he did it. And he brought his own genius and insight to it. And I felt a connection with that. And I always said, well, he wouldn't mind if I did this. I also learned a lot more about farming. I learned a lot more about the issues of chemicals and factory farming. And I thought that was quite fascinating. I did live in Iowa at the time. And I was totally dumbfounded when it won the Pulitzer Prize. I was just totally dumbfounded. I was amazed. But, thank heaven, hallelujah, whatever. The one that was supposed to be the romance, this is the one I say is the one that won't leave me alone. And this is called The All True Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton. I was in Washington, D.C. with my daughter, who was, she would have been about 6 or 7 at the time of the Oklahoma bombing. And I called her dad to say that we were okay, because we had no idea what was going on. And I was afraid to be in Washington. He was a professor of American history. And I was quite upset by the bombing, as you could imagine. And I said, I need to write about this part of American history. And the first word out of his mouth was Kansas. And since I grew up in St. Louis, I knew that Kansas existed. But I didn't know very much about the problems in Kansas before the Civil War. So I came home and I started reading about those, and I thought those were truly fascinating too. And so I decided I was going to have this girl who grows up in Illinois, across the river from Missouri, and whose husband, she marries an abolitionist. He takes her to Kansas, and then she has this adventure. Now, a romance is not always about love. A romance started out being about roaming. It started out to be about being about going places, seeing things, getting into fights and arguments. So this was my romance, The All True Travels and Adventures of Lidie Newton. It got pretty well reviewed. I won't say it was unsuccessful. There are some people that quite like it. But the issues that it explores, the issues of racism, the issues of North versus South, the issues of community versus individualism, issues of violence, issues of, in some sense, should government control the way people act or should it not? These issues continue and continue and continue. So this is why this is the one that won't leave me alone. I think about it a lot. And I don't know. It's those, I wish those issues would get behind us. So it's now 5:25. I'll say a couple more things about my process. About 5 days a week, I get up in the morning, I have a little breakfast, and then I write about 1,000 to 1,500 words of the book I'm working on. If I can't come up with something, with an idea, then I just throw something in. Sometimes I look around and I see something on the wall, a painting or something, and I put something in about that. I always say that you never know if what you put into it is a pebble or a seed. And sometimes the thing that you thought was of no importance, it was just pushing the story along, turned out to give you a good idea about where you're going and how to get there. I think it's really important to be regular. I think it's really important not to be self-critical in the first draft, but to just keep on going. And then you take the draft, you put it away, you come back to it a few months later, and you think about it then, and then you try the second draft. You have to be willing to do as many drafts as you can, as you must. But it's not your job as the writer of the first draft to judge it while you're writing it. I always say, and this is the last thing I'll say, I always say that you have a reader brain and a writer brain. Your reader brain is made up of all those books that you read over the years that understands how books work. Your writer brain is trying to make it work, your own book work. Your writer brain isn't as well educated as your reader brain. So you have to let the writer brain step back and let the reader brain take over. And the way you do that is you put the manuscript away, take a break from it, and then read it after you've sort of forgotten what it was like before. So it's now 5:28. Maybe I've gone on a little too long. And I love questions, so please ask questions.
That was great. This is, I'm sure where normally we would all like erupt in applause and so on, but digital. So thank you for that. We have a lot of questions already, and I think everyone, just so you know, in the questions, if there's one that you really like, you can upvote it, and then I will try and read them out. But I figured since you kind of left off with editing and setting aside, I know we had a question on that. And so why don't we, I guess, here we go. Yeah, years ago at a reading this is from Perry Thorndike. Years ago at a reading at Kepler's, and shortly after The Greenlands was published, you described doing research, taking notes on piles of 3x5 cards. Oh, this is research. How do you do research now, and do you research systematically or serendipitously? This is one I really like too.
Good. I would say I research serendipitously because each book is different, and so it requires a different kind of research. One of the main things I love to do in order to do research is to go to the place where the book is set. So I went to Kansas. Obviously, I was in Iowa. I went to Greenland. I went to the racetrack, but only for research. Anyway, so going to the place gives me a real sense of what it would be like for the characters to live there. I read history books. Now that we have the internet, there's a lot of ways to do research. And I love to take the Google boy out for a walk and on Google Maps and have him peer around. And so it depends. I do lots of research, but what the research is depends on the subject of the book. And I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. I remember hearing Umberto Eco one time talk about how he wanted to go to Constantinople, so he wrote Baudolino
Ha!
to travel there. So it made me think of that when you mentioned the going, to do, um,
Well, let
yeah,
me
that
say,
one.
I wouldn't. I had a Fulbright to Iceland, when I was in graduate school, and I probably wouldn't have even gotten interested in the Greenlanders if I hadn't been to Iceland and seen what a strange place it was. And then to go to Greenland, to then go to Greenland, it was really interesting to me to see how different Greenland was from Iceland, and to imagine the Icelanders in their boats arriving in Greenland in, say, the 12th century or the 13th century, and saying, wow, this is paradise compared to where we're from. And so that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. There's another question here that relates to research that a lot of people also have, which is your research primarily through archives, libraries, interviews? How do you keep from getting caught up in the research rapture and actually keep writing? Which is, I would love an answer to this question. So yeah.
Well, I love research, but I also like writing. So what I do is I wait until I do the research until the idea for the beginning of the book is triggered. And then I start writing the book. And then I do the research and the writing kind of going back and forth. I read books about what's going on, and then I think about how to fit that into the book. And then at some point, I'll know enough to get all the way to the end. And then when I do the later drafts, I'll come to places where I say, oh, this doesn't really make sense. And I'll go back and do more research to try and make sense. Or I'll think, I don't know actually what I'm talking about here. So I have to do my own fact checking. I do have friends who give me lots and lots of help. So one of my best helpers is one of my ex-husbands. And I've put him in a lot of books. He keeps saying to me, why do you keep killing me off? I said, but he has a great memory. He was in the 101st Airborne in Vietnam. He has a wonderful, he's been in tons of, let me put it this way. He has a history of adventures. And if I can't think of something where I know he's been, I can call him up and say, do you remember when? He'll say, oh yeah, sure, blah, 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 blah. So that's good. My husband, right now, he's been a lot of places and done a lot of things. And I wrote one book called Good Faith, based on his life in the real estate business. And so, what can I say? I talk to people, I read books, I go places, and I let my curiosity guide me.
You had mentioned in your talk and you just did now, how you get to a point where you realize you don't really know what you're talking about. Would you say that's just when the writing gets difficult, or is there something that triggers that for you? What exactly?
The writing gets difficult. I can't figure out what's going to happen next to the characters. And so I look something up to try and understand the era a little better. There's always the inner lives of the characters versus the outer lives, the political lives of the characters. And so if I don't know what's going on in their inner life, then I might look at events that were taking place around that time. I always know basically where they are, what season it is, what place they're in. Sometimes right down to what day it is. And those those are, you can, if you know those things, you can go find out. So when I was writing the trilogy, this was interesting. I found a website. I think it was an Iowa State University website that said what the weather had been day by day in Iowa from about 1900 on. And that was a wonderful, wonderful website for me, because if I wondered what my characters were doing, I knew exactly where they lived, and I knew what day and what year it was. And if I wondered what they were doing, I'd check the weather, and I would figure out what they were doing, and also how the crops were coming along. So those sorts of things are very helpful, very practical kind of details about whether it was raining, whether it wasn't raining, whether it was snowing, all that sort of thing.
I think that's really pretty amazing. I like the idea of having weather for each day already mapped out.
It blew me away. I had no idea that they had this website, but it was a great one.
We have a question from Chuck Kramer that is, did you intend to write the last 100 Years trilogy before you wrote Some Luck, or did it grow organically? What got you started? How did you feel about it? And this kind of flows with,
I'm going to show
outlines?
you. I'm going to show you. So this guy, the guy that this character is based on, he lives down in LA, and we were sitting in a restaurant, and he said, well, what are you going to work on now? And I said, well, I really would like to write a book called The Last 100 Years. And he whipped around and looked at me and he said, don't tell anybody that title or somebody will steal it. So I thought, wow, that's a good review. What I wanted to do was take this farm family and follow them from 1920 to 2019. And I wanted to go year by year. I didn't want to give dramatic events all the space. I wanted also there to be quiet periods, because that's what our lives are like, Quiet periods alternate with the dramatic periods. So I thought, okay, how am I going to do this? And I mapped out, I wrote down who the characters were, what their names were, when they were born. And one of the things that really interested me, since I have kids of my own, was how each of my kids was just exactly the way he or she was from the day they were born. And I thought, well, nobody's ever written about this that I know of. And so I wanted to include that idea that we're going to watch the characters from birth, essentially almost, or in some cases to death. And we're going to follow them. We're going to follow their psychology, starting with what they were like when they were babies. And I won't call him the main character, but the first baby to be born is an adventurous, opinionated kid. And he's always that way. He starts out that way and he continues to be that way. And he's the one who gets off the farm, who gets us out into the world, who sees a lot of other things because his parents can't stop him. And then his brother is the sweetheart who does what he should and is very conscientious, not terribly adventurous. And then we go down the list, and there's 5 kids. And then I started thinking, okay, so who are these people going to marry, and what are their children going to be like? And I guess it all grew out of just at the time that I started writing it, my kids were grown. I could look around at my family and at my kids and at my cousins and all of that, and I could see how they had developed over the years. And that's what fascinated me about it.
How much of that, so it sounds like there's a lot of plan of the characters, do you do a lot of planning of like the character arcs or the conflicts that they'll experience beforehand, or does that come like naturally as you start writing them?
I think for me, it comes naturally as they express their personalities. So I would know the personality of that character, and I'd look around, see what was happening when he or she was a certain age, and I would think, okay, what's the most likely thing that would happen? Um, and then I would say, okay, is that interesting or not interesting? But it's sort of that's how I did that with those characters.
Awesome. All right, it looks like we have a couple questions about specific novels. So, about A Private Life, Moss Ingram asks, how much rewriting did you do after you experienced a breakthrough of empathy for the physicist?
I think I did one more draft, um, and my editor accepted it and believed in it now.
That makes,
Yeah,
di-
so I think I did one more draft, but altogether I probably did 9 drafts. Um,
okay.
there, and some of you might have caught this, but it was first written in first person. First draft was in first person. And then I realized that I didn't want to write it in first person because I didn't think that my character had really wanted to have that kind of an inner life. And then I had to think up a reason about why she doesn't have much of an inner life. And so that's what happens at the end. We discover why it is what's kept her sort of closed off to herself. But a perspicacious reader will see that there was one spot where I did not change the point of view properly. And you can tell that it started out in the first person.
Interesting to be able to see that so clearly yourself, probably, where you almost wonder if everyone catches it in that reading.
Well, the
Uh,
copy editor is supposed to catch it, but neither
yeah.
of us caught it. Yeah.
On Lidie Newton, Perry Thorndike says the dialogue narrations almost entirely in modern language rather than mid-19th century vernacular.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how did you decide on that voice and the language style to use there?
Well, I did. I read books that were written at the time, and I did my best to sort of mimic the books that were written at the time. But I also knew there was going to be a lot of action in Lidie Newton, and I didn't want the action to get bogged down in the language. In the Greenlanders, I didn't mind if the action got bogged down in the language, but in Lidie Newton, I wanted it to keep going. I wanted to be able to depict what was going on and the landscape in a way that the modern reader would see it. So it's there's never a perfect answer to how to write a historical novel. So you just sort of toss the dice and hope for the best.
Like that. I like that it's different too, where you feel it matches whatever the book you're trying to write is, how that comes about. Um, Undulation, I'm not sure who this actually is, asked about
Okay.
changes in writing versus style depending on gender. How does that come in? Does that change, Greenlanders with Greenlanders or Lidie Newton? How does that impact?
Um, I would say that when I first started out, because all the books that I read in high school and junior high, and mostly in college too, were written by men, then the inner lives of men came more easily into my imagination than the inner lives of women. And that's imagining me as having no inner life. But I don't think that you or I'm not the sort of person to depict my own inner life. Um, as I've gotten older, I've had more main characters that are women and fewer that are men, and it's become more natural to me. But I guess I'd have to say, Charles Dickens did it to me. Now, outside of school, I did read Jane Austen, George Eliot, those two. But maybe because we had to study the books by male writers, somehow they stuck in my mind in a different way.
That makes a lot of sense, how different things can influence you there. Okay, here's a good one. Thad Nadine asked about different drafts. So you said you wrote about 9 drafts with one of your
For
novels.
private life, yeah, for
Yeah, for
private
private
life,
life.
yeah.
Would you say that's normal? How
Mm-mm.
many, they want to know, have you ever thought of a novel as finished, but it wasn't? How many drafts do you normally write and so
It drove me bananas to have to write that
on?
many drafts. I kid you not when I say the Greenlanders was one draft.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Um, the others have probably been more like three. I think usually it's about three. And then the fourth draft, I'm just fixing stuff. Um, I don't mind writing drafts, and I don't know that I'm the one to say whether it's finished. Um, some of them, I was really sad to see them go. The editor thought they were good and ready, and I thought, gee, I don't want to say goodbye to this one. And others, I've thought, I'm done with you. I'm done with you. I'm done with you. I don't want to write any more drafts, but I had to write one anyway. I would say that for the last 100 years trilogy, it was like saying goodbye to relatives and getting on the train. I really enjoyed being with them and following them for 100 years, but I was ready to get on the train, and it seemed to me that to be done.
That's interesting. While you were reading, one of the things, or speaking, one of the things I was thinking of was it sounds like you have a very different, like, affective relationship with each novel you wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about how some you dread that next draft, are there, Greenlanders sound like it was just the easiest thing to flow in some ways, but
It
like,
was so strange. I felt like I was being transported out of my own world and into theirs. And after I was done with it, I thought that's really too weird. I don't want that to happen again. Um, I think it was the effect of the language, of making the language like maybe what I thought their language would be. But I totally enjoyed it. I was amazed by it, but it also sort of spooked me to have it just come through me like that. Some of
yeah,
the others are, I don't know. I always enjoy. I would say, I say that I didn't particularly enjoy some of them, but what it's like is it's like a puzzle, and even with private life, I really, really, really wanted to solve the puzzle. And so I was willing to keep at it, not because I wanted it to be published or not because I wanted my editor to be pleased, but because I wanted to solve the puzzle. And that's the thing I like about writing books, is that each one is like a puzzle. It's enjoyable to solve the puzzle. Sometimes you're frustrated, but you can't stop, because if it's not solved, then it sort of lingers in your mind as something that you still are fascinated by.
yeah. I think that's a really interesting way to think of it. Have there ever been one that you, while writing it, going back between research and writing and so on, were just unsure at all if it was a solvable puzzle, or that you just abandoned completely because the idea of going back to it wasn't pleasant? Like,
I haven't abandoned one since about 1980. And I don't even remember which one it was that I abandoned. I feel like if I rustled through the papers, there is one that I said, eh. But no, all the others, I think I just said, boy, I'm interested. I'm still interested. I'm still interested. Okay, it's done.
that's pretty great. All right, let's check in on the questions. Do you write a
Okay.
detailed outline? We've pretty much covered that, I would say.
Well, it varies. It varies from book to book.
Yeah.
So for for 1,000 Acres, yes, I had to follow Shakespeare's play as well as I could. So I wrote a detailed plan. It wasn't exactly an outline, but it was a plan. For Moo, what I really wanted to do, since there were a lot of characters, was to not lose track of the characters. And so I didn't write an outline, but I wrote a grid. I drew a grid, and along the top I wrote what month and week it was, and along the side I wrote the names of the characters. Excuse me. Along the top I wrote the chapters, and along the side I wrote the names of the characters. And then if a character appeared in a chapter, I would check it off. And then I could look at the grid and see who I was losing track of. And if I was losing track of several, they'd have a party, and they'd all show up at the party. So that was an organizational principle for Moo. For Lidie, I just followed Lidie, and a lot of other characters came and went, but they had to have some kind of importance in her life. And so it varies.
Makes sense. Yeah, and I think we've heard like a lot about the different ways you conceptualize like crafting it, especially through character and stuff. But conflict is something that Robin asked about, and she wants to know if you think it is possible to have a quieter book today that can involve internal conflict rather than external, and how you think of that.
Sure. I mean, one of the things, I wrote a book called 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. And it's an analysis of how novels work. And one of the things that it talks about is the nature of plot. The plot in a play or a book is about the conflict and conflict is the source of the logical progress of the book. But the conflict doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be between two people. It can be between one part of the main character and another part of the main character. And then the book can explore that life. Excuse me. It can explore what's going on in the mind of the main character as he or she works out those inner conflicts. I think I think everything is acceptable in general. And basically what I say is try it. See what you think. Let your writer brain go for it, and then put it away for a couple of months and then see what your reader brain thinks. You've become totally still. You still there? Am I still here? Hello? Okay, Diane says, do you recommend your book Taking the Reins for a new 9-year-old who reads every minute she can and is advanced in her choices? Good. Okay. He's frozen, but I'm so sorry about that. I didn't think that could happen in Santa Cruz, but you know. Any tips for finding an agent? I'm sorry, I have no tips about finding an agent. You just have to keep hoping and sending and trying to get in touch. I wish I could say. I mean, I've had the same agent for 35 years. I can't really give any tips about what it's like in this world. Okay. Somebody asked, there he is again.
Sorry about that. My video apparently froze. I need to refresh my screen there for a second. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if you answered it, but Emily asked, who are your favorite contemporary writers and authors? And I thought maybe that would be a good question to end off on. What have you been reading that has really spoke to you or so on?
Well, actually, I'm terrible at remembering titles. I did a review for the LA Times in the spring. What was it? I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. But look up the LA Times for Jane Smiley review. The book I reviewed, I loved. I thought it was great. There's tons of people out there writing, and I mostly read whatever I lay my hands on, and I like almost everything. So, wish I could remember what that book was. Darn it.
We'll have to look it up. Maybe we'll include it in some other talk as the start off or something. This
Okay.
James Smiley's recommendation. All right. So yeah, let's do another one then for the final question. Let's see what we have that we haven't got to yet. We have one on, so the current agricultural secretary, Cerny Perdue, recently reiterated the go big or go away to family farmers in Wisconsin. What are the chances of selling a novel that is set amid the current farm crisis?
Go
From
for
Lisa.
it. I have no idea what the chances are of selling it, but go for it. Because there has to be constant reminders of what is going on. I mean, part of your job as a novelist is to try and understand your own world, but also the political implications of your world. And it's interesting to the reader to read it, but it's also important to put your voice out there and to say, this is what I think is going on, and this is what we need how we need to perceive it. And that's what novels are for, is for showing the reader your way of feeling something and perceiving it, and hoping that somehow that proves to the reader that issue, whatever you're talking about, is worth thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question to end on, especially with everything going on now.
Yeah.
And so I think we'll end there. I want to thank everyone for coming. And down at the bottom, there's the buy her books. So this will take you to the Catamaran store. So if Jane made you want to pick up any of her books, we have a bunch there. Jane, it was amazing to have you here. Like, I really enjoyed the talk, the questions and answers and everything. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Do check out the rest of the readings. Tomorrow, poetry, Tuesday, fiction, and Wednesday, nonfiction. So check those out and go ahead and sign up for those as well. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. I really had fun. And I'm glad I didn't have the opportunity to sneeze at you.
All right. The books will be signed, by the way, just so everyone knows. The ones purchased through our store as well by Jane.
Yes.
The nameplates will be in there.
The plates, yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jane.
Bye-bye.
Bye.